If you would, open up to Nahum chapter 1. Nahum chapter 1. Anybody remember what the name Nahum means? Comfort, compassion, both of those words would be fitting. And yet, within the book of Nahum, what is really the theme? God Almighty? Judgment. God bringing a judgment upon the Assyrians, specifically in the city of Nineveh. And in doing that, you kind of see a little bit of a double play here. Nahum's name, comfort, compassion. Same time, what's going on in the book is about judgment. So, you see those things at hand. Whenever you see what's here, I want you to think just about the life of Jesus for a little bit. If you remember in the life of Jesus, once he turns about 30, he moves away from Nazareth and he moves to another town that's kind of his home base after that. Do you remember what the name of that town is? If you think your way through Matthew chapter 4, you'll come up with the town of Capernaum, also known as Capernaum. Capernaum may sound just like what you're thinking. It is the town of Nahum. Now, here's what's unique. With Jesus, did he come to bring just compassion and just comfort? Or is it kind of like the book of Nahum where he also brings a judgment? So you see, even sometimes in the life of Christ, these little things kind of pop up. And you realize everything is dependent upon the hearts of the people. Now, if you look here in Nahum chapter 1, real quickly, look down at verses 7 and 8. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who take refuge in him. So if you respond to take refuge in the Lord, what do you know will happen? He'll take care of you. You'll be protected. Now, here's the other side, verse 8. But with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of its sight and will pursue his enemies into darkness. What if you don't stand with the Lord? What's going to happen? Here comes a judgment from the Lord. And notice, what does he specifically bring out here? Two things. How's he going to bring this judgment about? Overflowing flood. And he says, I will pursue them even into the darkness. And you think about, that's where the scary stuff happens. They go, you don't even know where it's coming from. It's so dark. You don't know which way to try to be protected because you're not sure where you're being attacked from. These are the two things he brings out very specifically. Now, in looking at this, I want you to kind of remember, I know Brent went through this a little bit before, but thinking about just the city of Nineveh, the city is along the Tigris River in the land, of course, of the Assyrians. The circumference of the city walls covers about 60 miles. So if you think about all the effort it would take to build these walls, If you had 60 miles worth of walls to surround your city, how do you think you would generally feel about it? Feel safe, feel secure. If you kind of want to put a little image with this, it depends on what part of town you live in. In order to get a 60-mile circumference, it means if it was a circle, which it probably wasn't, you're talking about 19 miles across. Now, if you stand at the Capitol site in town, it's about 19 miles, as the crow flies, to go to Eugene High School. Can you imagine a city being that big? Maybe you're from further up north, from the state capitol up to the very southern city limit of Fulton, about 19 miles, as the crow flies. Does that sound small or big to you? I hope you're understanding, this is larger than Jefferson City. Now, as part of this, the walls are very high. The army is very large, is very fortified. There are towers all along the wall to look out and to shoot from. And in addition with that, the population is pretty close to 1 million people just within the walls. Sound like they have plenty of manpower? And yet, it sits along the Tigris River. Now, in seeing these things together, I want us to look a little bit into Ezekiel and Zechariah for just a moment, because I want you to pick up some details. We know that what's going on here in the book of Nahum is a judgment upon Nineveh. And in seeing this, you kind of imagine this is what Jonah would have loved to tell the people of Nineveh. If he could have been this prophet, he would have been chomping at the bit to tell them about they're really going to be destroyed, especially if God wasn't going to relent because of their repentance, some 150 years before here, or 100 years before. Look back at the book of Ezekiel, look at chapter 31. Ezekiel 31. I wish we had time to read through a whole lot more of this, but we really don't. Ezekiel 31, look at verse 2. It says, Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, whom are you like in your greatness? Now, this is Ezekiel talking to Pharaoh, and this is kind of after the fact of what happens with Nineveh. But I want you to just kind of notice the illustration. What does Ezekiel ask Pharaoh? What does he ask him? Who are you like in your greatness? I mean, this is really a setup question, isn't it? You know it from the get-go. I mean, how great do you really think you are? So, did I say something different? Verse 2? All right. Ezekiel 31, verse 2. Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his hordes, whom are you like in your greatness? Verse 3. Behold, Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon, with beautiful branches and forest shade, and very high, and its top was among the clouds. What was it like in Assyria? Beautiful. He says, there's large. Look about beautiful branches, forest shade, very high. He says the top was among the clouds, humongous. He says Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon. Cedars were known for their strength. They were known for their height. They were known for even the strength in terms of power. But here's Ezekiel talking to Pharaoh and saying, how great are you? He says, do you think you're as great as Assyria? Making a comparison. He says, as mighty as Assyria? And I want you to see the illustration that's really being used is Assyria is being compared to this tall, majestic, powerful tree. Now, how did it get that way? Look down at verse 9, same chapter. I made it beautiful with the multitudes of its branches, and all the trees of Eden which are in the garden of God were jealous of it. Who made Assyria to be as great as they were? God did. Now, did the Assyrians think that? No. Who did the Assyrians think did it? They did. Now, is this easy for us to do? It's easy to look at the Assyrians and go, yeah, they should have known better. We need to really look at ourselves here. You know, whenever we start to think that, well, we are really good. We've really got this thing. Because of our work, it's turned out this way. And you realize, look down a little bit further in the same chapter. Look down at verse 16. Once again, here's the Lord God speaking. I made the nations quake at the sound of its fall when I made it go down to Sheol with those who go down to the pit. And all the well-watered trees of Eden, the choicest and best of Lebanon, were comforted in the earth beneath. What did God do with Assyria? Earthquake, what else? It's kind of a little hidden in here. What did he do to the great big tree? He said, I made it go down. He says, I cut down the great big old tree. He says, I raised it up and I chopped it down. Which tells you who's in control. God is totally. Now, does man always see that? No. Did the Assyrians go, well, the reason we're so great is because of God? No. They were looking to themselves in pride. And you see God came through, he says, and I just chopped you down. Now, notice what was the effect on everyone else on the earth, all these other nations. What did they find? These other trees. They found comfort in it. Oh, you mean the big bully's done? Yeah, finished. Now, look at verse 17. It says, they also went down with it to Sheol to those who were slain by the sword, and those who were its strength lived under its shade among the nations. How did God do it? What did he use? The sword. Now, you start to see kind of a little bit of a layout. Now, this is just a general statement about Assyria. This is not specific about Nineveh just yet. But I want you to look back at Ezekiel chapter 14. Just one verse. Look at verse 21. If you're a note taker, I'm going to give you something here in just a minute. Ezekiel 14, verse 21. This is aimed specifically at Jerusalem. So I'm just showing you this to see what the 4 severe judgments of God are. This is not something specifically aimed at Assyria here, but notice them. It says, for thus says the Lord God, how much more when I send my 4 severe judgments against Jerusalem? Sword, famine, wild beasts, and plague to cut off man and beast from it. So what are the 4 severe judgments of God? Sword, what's another name for that? War. What's the next one? Famine. So what would that look like? Drought. Could be very hot. Hunger. Realize that could all go together with famine. What's the next one? Wild beasts. In terms of thinking, hey, whenever the lions go crazy, or any other wild beast at that, realize who stands in control? God does. Who stands in control during war? God does. Who stands in control of the food? God does. Who stands in control of the beasts? God does. Now, what's the 4th severe judgment of God? Plague. What's another name for that? Disease. Who stands in control of that? God does. And to go, these are the 4 severe judgments of God that he was going to bring upon Jerusalem for their what? Because they were righteous? No, because of their wickedness. And so you see the justice of God come down, and you see who's in complete control. Now, don't make the application of, well, I've been in a war. Was that the most? It's not about individuals here. This is a bigger picture. So don't think, I've been sick before. Was that the wrath of God against me? No, unless you were doing wicked. Then you got something to think about. But just to see these 4 severe judgments of God and how specific it is. If you even want to know, there are some that are specific against Assyria. Little note for you. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 25, it specifically talks about how God sent the wild beasts in whenever the Assyrians started to come back to what we know of as Samaria, and they weren't honoring God, and He sent the wild beasts against them. Realize, who's in control? Here's God saying, I will be treated as holy. You can't just do it any old way you want. Now, so you see that happen, that's specifically against Assyria in 2 Kings 17. I want you to look a little bit further, and I want you to think even about Jesus. Remember Jesus in the garden? Whenever Peter really jumps the gun, and he's got the sword, and they're going to arrest Jesus, and Peter reaches up and he lops off Malchus's ear and strikes him, and Jesus responds and says, don't do that. Put the sword away. And then Jesus makes a statement right after that. You remember what it is? Yeah, if you paraphrase it, if you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. How had Assyria gone about warring and conquering? By the sword. What do you expect to happen to Assyria? They're going to die by the sword. You realize, hey, God's going to keep His promise. It's going to go the way that He says it will. No nation, no man has the ability to rebel against God and change God's plans. It just doesn't happen. Now, once again, you look at this. Now let's look a little bit more specifically at Nineveh. Look over at the book of Zechariah. If you're in Nahum, just go a little bit to your right. Zephaniah. Man, I'll get it right. Sorry. Zephaniah chapter 2. Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 2. Look at verses 13, 14, and 15. It's going to tell you about the mindset of those in Nineveh and the Assyrians. It's kind of interesting. Sometimes you can look in other places and find out the real situations of what's going on in other places. Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 13. And he's speaking this to the Ethiopians to warn them, but verse 13. He says, and he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation, parched like the wilderness. Who's in control? God. Is He controlled of whether the wilderness is parched? Is He in control of what happens by the sword? He says He'll make Nineveh a desolation. When you think of desolation, what do you think of? What's your mental image when you think of desolation? Destruction, desert, completely wiped out. I remember several times in my life going to see the wreckage of a tornado. And I mean, to see places that used to be lush with trees, everything stripped down to almost just looking like poles standing in the ground. Houses completely destroyed, made out of the finest materials. And you realize nothing even functions anymore. They've shut off all the electricity, all the plumbing, the sewage, everything, and it just reeks. And he goes, complete and utter desolation. And here's God saying, this is what I'm going to do to Nineveh. Verse 14. Flocks will lie down in her midst. All beasts which range in herds, both the pelican and the hedgehog, will lodge in the tops of her pillars. Birds will sing in the window. Desolation will be on the threshold, for he has laid bare the cedar work. He says, notice, God in control of the herds? Yeah. Even the pelican and the hedgehog? Even the birds that sit in the windows and sing? Now, why do you think it brings up the birds? Doesn't that seem like something unique to bring up in the midst of all this? What's he telling you? Who's he going to take care of? Or better yet, what's he going to take care of?
Well, the birds depend on God.
Yeah. It says, here's these little tiny birds, and what did God do with them? They're doing just fine. Yet how does Nineveh look? In all their strength and all their power, they're desolate. And yet these little birds are sitting in the broken out windows, and they're just singing their song. Little, tiny, helpless birds. Do you see the strength of God versus the pride of man? Now, notice how he continues. Verse 15. This is the exultant city which dwells securely, who says in her heart, I am and there is no one besides me. How she has become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. What happened to her? Now, look inside. He says, this is the city of all the pride, all the exultant. And yet in all this, he says, she's become a desolation. She thought, who else is there besides me? Who can rival my strength and my power? And yet now, nothing. He says, even everybody who passes by will just wave their hand in contempt. Like nothing. Oh, just nothing. Now, come back over to Nahum chapter 1. Look at verse 14. The Lord has issued a command concerning you. Who is you? Nineveh. Your name will no longer be perpetuated. I will cut off idol and image from the house of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are contemptible. When the Lord issues a command, what's going to happen? It will happen. There's no way to get around it. Then, he says, you're not going to be perpetuated any longer. He says, there's not going to be other generations. He says, I'm going to cut off idol and image. Assyria had become so tied into their polytheism, in other words, thinking of all these little gods, that they thought, we don't have to fear Jehovah God. He's just the God of Israel. So he only works in the land of Israel. We're in Assyria. So we don't have to be concerned about that. And that's the way they thought about all the other gods too, which tells you about their pride. Then he says, I will cut off idol and image from the house of your gods. I will prepare your grave. What do you call the person who prepares the grave? I'm not talking about the body. I'm talking about the grave. What do you call that person? Undertaker. Maybe somebody might call him a grave digger. What's God saying to Nineveh? I've already dug your grave. We would probably hear that and go, and you're going down. Right? Now, here he is. I'll prepare your grave. It says, for you are contemptible. What's the character of these people in Nineveh? They have no honor for God. That's what contempt is, right? It means to not show proper honor. Maybe you probably think in terms of contempt, like being in a courtroom scene and somebody gets way out of hand. The judge says, I'm going to find you in contempt because you're not showing me the proper honor that is due me. Now, if you notice how it continues, verse 15, he says, behold on the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace. Celebrate your feasts, O Judah. Now who's he addressing? Is this going to have an effect on God's people? Yeah, he says, you know what? There's going to be good news that's coming because Nineveh's going down. And remember, that's going to bring comfort to all the others because the bully's going down. Then, he says, celebrate your feasts, O Judah, pay your vows, for never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. He says, you can be at peace, you can be at rest. My hand is about to come down. I've already dug their grave. And now I'm going to pour out my wrath. Chapter 2 opens up. The one who scatters has come up against you. Man the fortress, watch the road, strengthen your back, summon all your strength. What's he telling them? This is now the people of Nineveh. What's he saying? Come in all your strength. God's not coming to say, well, I'm going to wait till you're weak and then I'm going to come in and I'll destroy you. Who works like that? Satan does. Think about Job. When does he attack Job? After Job has been destroyed, bit by bit, according to what God has allowed him to have to endure and to empower him to overcome it. If you think about when does he tempt Jesus? He's fasted for 40 days, and what's the first thing that he tempts him with? Turn these stones into bread. Satan's not one who wages war in honor. He goes after you at your weakest. Whenever God passes judgment, he says, I'm going to come at you, and I'm going to let you know about it. And you can go ahead and get ready. And by the way, it's about 30 years before the judgment's coming, whenever this book is written. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but about 30 years. He says, I'm giving you notice. They don't want to change their hearts. They don't want to change their minds. They're all about pride. And he says, get ready. I'm coming. Now.
It's like the example of Pharaoh, where
Right.
he brings the message to him, gives him ample opportunity to repent, to let his people go. But then the plagues come.
Right.
The frogs, the famine, all that kind of stuff happens. But his heart is so hardened that he can't turn away.
He's not going to move away. You see, Pharaoh, God comes against Egypt to destroy, to take his people out. Egypt's in the very height of what they have in terms of military, everything else, and you see God just bring plague after plague after plague after plague, and their heart never changes, and they get destroyed.
It's similar to this because it's pride.
Back to pride.
It's what I have done that has gotten me instead of what has God given.
Right. And how am I going to respond to what he's given? Look at verse 2. He says, for the Lord will restore the splendor of Jacob like the splendor of Israel, even though devastators have devastated them and destroyed their vine branches. What is God saying he's going to do for Israel, the sons of Jacob? He says, I'm going to lift you back up. Because where is Judah and Israel at this point in time? They're in captivity. He says, and I'm going to bring you out and I'm going to raise you up. Then, verse 3, he starts to show the kind of the layout of things here. Well, before we cover 3 through the end here, I'm just going to read you a little bit of history. I'm going to just tell you about how it happened, how the destruction of Nineveh went down. There was a king, or an emperor at the time. His name was Esarhaddon, and he's actually Esarhaddon II. And he reigns from about 620 to about 612 BC. 612 is when Nineveh gets destroyed. So that's the end of his reign, by the way. You'll see why here in a minute. And in doing this, the time comes, and all of a sudden, Assyria and all their pride and strength, they think they have these other people who are going to come and fight for them. They're actually called a group, this is going to sound kind of funny to you, the Bactrians. Sounds a whole lot like bacteria, doesn't it? But they've been hired out, but Assyria doesn't even realize that the Bactrians are not really coming. They catch wind of what's going on and they never show up. The Assyrians have gotten so full of pride that they've kind of, even in the armies, have given themselves over to drinking. They've given themselves over to every kind of slothful activity. And so they're really out of shape. It's almost like we're getting the old band together again, but nobody's been doing any exercises. And so here they all are together, and in the midst of all these things, the unthinkable happened. The rains start coming. They've been under siege for about 3 years. They're all within these walls. There's a lot of ground, so they could have a little bit of crops for a while, but guess what comes in? Any severe judgments of God might affect that? What if you start to have a famine? Now, what if you start to have wild beasts that come in? I haven't found anything that talks about pestilence, but you can only imagine. Now, listen to this. This is just a historian. His name's Robert Ferguson. His book is entitled Nineveh and Its Ruin, which tells you what he knows. Listen to this. I'll just read this to you a little bit. It says, there was an old tradition that Nineveh should not be taken till the river Tigris, which defended part of the city, should become its enemy. Now it so happened in the 3rd year of the siege, it became so swollen by continued rains that it overflowed part of the city and threw down a considerable portion of the wall. The king, as our Hayden II, the king, thinking that the oracle was fulfilled by this inundation of the river and giving up all hope of future safety, lest he should fall into the enemy's hands, built a large funeral pile in the palace. And having collected all his gold and silver and royal vestments, together with his concubines and his eunuchs, set fire to the pile, and thus involved himself and them and the whole palace in one common ruin. When the fate of the king was made known by certain deserters, the enemy entered by the breach which the waters had made and took the city. Who stepped in? God did. He made it rain. And it rained so much that the river flooded. And it flooded so much that it got up to take over the wall and even took a large portion of the wall down, which made a breach. And the armies that were sieging right outside of those walls now had an easy entrance to come on in. The king is so overwhelmed that he gathers together all of his gold and his silver and his royal vestments and gathers together his concubines and his eunuchs. And he sets fire to himself, all of those things, and the palace. And to think, here you are in the midst, if you're one of those people of Nineveh, and everything is just coming in all at once. All the desolation. Now, here they are. Whose hand do you see coming down heavy? It's God's hand, because that's not something anybody else can do. And he takes them down in their prime. Now, knowing that takes place in 612 BC. Look at the way the description is given here in Nahum. And Nahum comes about 30 years before those events. Listen to what God says to them, and then see if you can see it in the history that we just read. Nahum chapter 2, look at verse 3. The shields of his mighty men are colored red. The warriors are dressed in scarlet. The chariots are enveloped in flashing steel when he is prepared to march, and the cypress spears are brandished. You may have a little footnote in verse 3 where it says, his mighty men. What does the footnote say? Anybody got one? You see where it says those attacking Nineveh? Yeah. He says, those are God's mighty men. He's using these other nations to come in and destroy Nineveh of Assyria. He says, those who are coming in, he says, their mighty men are colored red, because who's dying? The citizens of Nineveh, right? He says the warriors are dressed in scarlet. How did they get turned scarlet? Blood. It's also the color of the country that God used. The chariots are enveloped in flashing steel. Whenever the palace is on fire, what does it do to the metal? What does it make it look like it's doing? It makes it look like it's flashing. He says, when he is prepared to march and the cypress spears are brandished. In other words, here they come in ready to run them through. Verse 4. The chariots race madly in the streets. They rush wildly in the squares. Their appearance is like torches. They dash to and fro like lightning flashes. Notice, is it just one or two chariots? They're just going through this whole place. Because whenever you come in through the breach, what does that do to everybody who's in the city? Now those walls that were a great protection turn into what? A trap. Isn't that interesting? What God does with the wisdom of man. What once upon a time they thought was protection, now turns into a trap. Notice what else is here. He says, they race madly in the streets, they rush wildly in the squares. I just want one statement out of chapter 3. I want you to notice it. It's actually in verse 3, chapter 3, verse 3. He says, many are slain, a mass of corpses and countless dead bodies. They stumble over the dead bodies. You can't even run because you'll trip over what? Dead bodies. Think about those chariots going through town. It's a bumpy ride because now you're running over other dead bodies. What do you see about God and justice? Anybody going to hold him back? God's not partial. Notice how he continues. Verse 5. He remembers his nobles. They stumble in their march. They hurry to her wall. And the mantelet is set up. Mantelet is what they do when they're going to build a siege wall against a siege ramp up against to overcome a wall. And as they build it, the mantelet is what they put up over the top so that you don't throw rocks down or spears. And at the same time, people were known to throw down tar. But this would be a shielding from that. He says, what are you going to do about it now? Nothing. Verse 6. The gates of the rivers are opened and the palace is dissolved. Yeah, would you say the palace is dissolved? The king even started the fire himself. At the same time, the gates of the rivers are opened. Remember what happened? God told them. He didn't say it's going to be a flood. He says, well, the gates of the rivers are going to be opened. He was going to bring the water. Verse 7. It is fixed. Anybody going to stop it? How many of you have been in Jeff City for longer than 30 years? Just raise your hand. Got a few of you? Remember the flood of 30 years ago? Remember whenever the waters went from the bluff there by the Capitol all the way over to the far bluff behind ABB or Hitachi? Anybody see that coming? Did it do any destruction? Yeah, a lot. Now, you start to realize, we think of that and we go, man, that was a lot if you were here. That's the kind of surprise that Nineveh got. Now, so when it says it is fixed, it says you can't change it. There was no way to get all that water out, was there? Didn't matter how many sump pumps you had, because you had no place to take it anyway. Then he says, it is fixed, she is stripped, she is carried away, and her handmaids are moaning like the sound of doves, beating on their breasts. And what is the response of those who are there? Despair, mourning. Verse 8. Though Nineveh was like a pool of water throughout her days. And just stop for a second. A pool of water. What usually happens at fresh water? Just in general. If you have animals, where do you take them? Take them there for a drink. If you're dirty, you might go there to take a bath. Water draws people in, doesn't it? Typically. If you have a pool at your house, you ever had anybody ask if they could use it? It happens, doesn't it? That's not the kind of pool he's talking about. But to realize here, he says, oh, Nineveh used to be like a pool. Everybody wanted to come. Is it that way now? Look at the rest of the verse. He says, now they are fleeing. Everybody used to come. What are they doing now? They're running. Stop, stop, but no one turns back. They tell them, don't do that, come back. And what happens? They keep on running. They don't stop. Verse 9. Plunder the silver, plunder the gold, for there is no limit to the treasure. Wealth from every kind of desirable object. How was the economy going in Nineveh? Ooh, it was running like a machine. They had all kinds of gold and silver. If there was an object that was desirable from any nation, you could find it there because they would sell it there with merchants. And yet, what are they doing now? Run. And don't stop. Now, in all of this, you realize, even with the king, what did he gather together before he started the fire? All of his gold and silver. Do him any good? Not one bit. Verse 10. She is emptied, yes, she is desolate and waste. Hearts are melting and knees knocking. Also anguish is in the whole body, and all their faces are grown pale. What's left? How do they look? Pale, scared to death. He says, you look at them. Then, look at verses 11 and 12. Where is the den of the lions and the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion, lioness, and lion's cub prowled with nothing to disturb them. The lion tore enough for his cubs, killed enough for his lionesses, and filled his lair with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Remember what one of the severe judgments of God is? Wild beasts. So as you run and flee from the city, thinking that you might just escape, what catches you? The lion, the wild beast. Now, here's a little something extra. In the country we live in, what is kind of the animal or bird that is emblematic of this country? An eagle, right? Well, in Assyria, do you know what their animal was that was symbolic for their country? The lion. Look at what he does. What once again was your pride, what does God do? Now it's your enemy. See how God turns the wisdom of the wise against them? Now, you see the picture here. He says, have torn the flesh enough to feed their family. He says, and you've been taken down. Verse 13, as if it wasn't obvious. Behold, I am against you. And what happens when he's against you? Now, you think about what he said in chapter 1. I already dug your grave. Now it's time to put you in it. And sure enough, he did. Whether it was by the sword, whether it was by beast, whether by anything else. And notice here in the end of verse 13, he says, behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts. I will burn up her chariots in smoke. Oh, you have military power. What's going to happen? Burn up in smoke. He says, a sword will devour your young lions. He says, your young lions. Not all of them. He says, yours. He says, oh, you think you're so tough, huh? He says, I will cut off your prey from the land, and no longer will the voice of your messengers be heard. He says, you're not going to get any messages anymore because nobody's going to want anything to do with you. All the things that you used to sell by way of trade, they're gone. All the silver and the gold, gone. It's already been plundered. He says, what does Nineveh have an abundance of? Dead corpses. That's what they have. Now, when you see this picture I hope we really stop to understand. If we start to think in terms of pride of going, well, we got the best military ever, or look at what we've done economically, or look at how strong we are and smart we are, look at our defenses, who do you think we'll end up like? Just like them. We better be mindful of who stands in utter control. And you'll see down in chapter 3, verse 5, he's going to make the same statement again. Behold, I am against you. Because this picture has only started. There's still a whole other chapter to go, and there's more to this. But for tonight, we'll just stop it right there to be able to see God's almighty hand is in control. And we better make sure that God is our refuge and that we are not His enemy. Because there's safety when you take refuge in Him, as opposed to the destruction that comes when He has declared Himself against us. All right. Have a good rest of the week.